All right. So down behind correct. I'm waiting for this one. You took the good shit, didn't you? This one is like possessed where I'm like, wait. Sorry. Okay. Great having everyone here. This is kind of a repeat, semi-repeat of what we had covered, what was that? June. And where we are looking at some of, well, really the main ideology that is very prominent in our culture. And so we're going to kind of get into that this week, next week. But before we do that, we're going to go ahead and open us up with a word of prayer. Father God, we are so thankful for those who are here. Thankful for these kinds of opportunities where we can gather together, we can learn more, we can grow, become more aware. And Father, we pray right now you would just fill us with the Holy Spirit, that you would help us to understand and comprehend some of the things that are going on in the world in order to help us and empower us to talk with people, to communicate with others, and to help guide them to the truth, to Jesus. Lord, we thank you for those who are here, and just ask your blessings upon them, upon their families, upon their kids, and we pray all this in Jesus' name. All right, well, what really started out in academia has become mainstream. A lot of this had been going on for quite some time, but it has really taken off in recent years, largely because of the widespread use of social media. And so, we're going to talk, really social media is going to come up a lot, this week and next week, just because social media has had such an impact really on influencing mass culture. And so what we are really going to look at, when you turn on the news and you see all of these things going on, behind the scenes is an ideology, a worldview called Post-Modernism. Now, Post-Modernism, this is something that a lot of people probably are not going to be like, yes, I adhere to the teachings of Post-Modernism. A lot of the stuff that we're probably going to talk about, people have probably never, even heard of. Some have not. In fact, some of you might be heavily influenced with postmodernism and not even realize it, because it's a world view. It's how you view the world, and until somebody says, "Hey, not everybody views it that way," or over there they view it this way, you don't really notice. It's kind of like looking at the lens, looking through a lens. It's not until you remove the lens that you see, oh, wait a minute, this is, I see things in 3D here, and I don't, this way. And so, we are, a lot of the ideology of postmodernism, it started in academia, the university, and it sort of was trickling its way down, I'd say. People go to school, they learn a lot of this stuff, but it's really kind of, I would say, it has become more mainstream in the last 5 years.
Yeah, you start seeing it sort of update in 2013 with certain buzzwords like social justice, but really the past 5 or 6 years where it feels that the damage is personal.
And I would say that is mainly because of social media.
Yeah, so we live in an era where, in other periods of history, like during the American Revolution, you didn't know if an event happened until much after the event occurred. You had to wait for the means of communication to get to you, and they didn't have cars or things like that. Now, it's like with our phones, like we have instant access to everything, so everything's accelerating much quicker.
And it seems like there is this, if it is widely accepted or if it's trending, people seem to just get wrapped up in it, and they believe it, and they're not even really stopping to think, is this something I should believe? And so, I'll kind of, a little bit of a story time. This was in the kids section in Barnes & Noble. These are the gay VCs. And when now this is a legit kid's book, this was in the story section, but it gets into all of the, some of the terminology that maybe, many of the adults may never hear, but I mean, they're targeting like children with a lot of this worldview. Now, this is just in this area, gender, queer theory. There are other categories as well that are related to this, even though they may not seem like they are related. That's what we're going to kind of get into. But B is for bi. You can shout it out loud. I like boys and girls, and that makes me proud. C is for coming out. You're ready to share what you feel deep inside. It's okay to be scared. Now, D is for drag. You can strut and dance in clothes that you love, dresses, heels, or pants. Now, the difficulty with some of this is as adults, we kind of process things, we kind of understand things. Kids, it's like, well, yeah, okay, I like to dress up as adults. It's like, okay, well, you're drag. They want to put a label right away. Puberty, one of the most confusing times. I don't know if anybody in here has ever gone through puberty. But it's a very, very difficult time, confusing time, where emotions and feelings and everything. Well, what we are doing in a society and a culture, what postmodern has done, is it has removed all standards, and it's just kind of like it's a free for all. And if a kid's like, well, I think he's good looking, if it's a boy and I think he's good, well, that's because you are. And it's like they put you in the category, you're right there. And so it's, but this is just an example. To kind of back up, I think if we were putting postmodernism sort of in our field, the church, if we were to think of it as a religion, postmodernism would sort of be the theology. All right, postmodernism is the theology. It's the overarching belief. I think you have described it as kind of like the soil.
Yeah. Think of postmodernism as it's sort of a metaphysical view from which you view reality, even though it decries metaphysics. And we'll get into all unpacking like what is it that they actually believe. But it's sort of the framework to which you view reality. From that, you have what's called critical theory. And from critical theory, it's sort of like
different
like postmodernism, how you view reality. Critical theory is how you act now in the world. So then from critical theory, you sort of think of it almost like an octopus with tentacles. Think of it like Hydra. From that, you then have queer theory, you have post-colonial theory, critical race theory, and feminist theory. But they're all rooted in postmodernism. That's the soil from which they grow from. And that's the metaphysics that they begin with.
Now, just to kind of give you a little postmodernism 101, if you're not familiar with this, what exactly is this? Postmodernism comes after modernism, thus post. Very creative, I know. But the main thing you need to understand is, modernism, the modern era, they believed in facts. They believed in science. They believed in reason. There is objective facts, and really the focus is science. And we move as a culture, as a society. The pre-modern era was, you had God was the ultimate reality. God is the ultimate authority. So right, wrong, truth, all of that stems from God. Well, the modern era gets away from God. It separates the sacred and the secular, and now God is dead. Friedrich Nietzsche, coins the term, which ironically he's sort of the postmodern guy as well. And so now God is dead, and so now we're left with reason, science, things like that. And so, yeah, go ahead.
I'll add with the advent of the modern period, this is the height of the scientific revolution. So you're seeing a lot of progress technologically speaking, so people have a lot of faith and trust in science. To a degree, I think that would be like way too far on the other side of the pendulum. So then what starts happening is you start having events that will occur in history that sort of shake this faith. So when you have like World War I, you have a great catastrophic event that's brought on by our technology. You have 19th century diamond tactics against the machine gun, 20th century technology, and it's a bloodbath. And then from that, you have the Great Depression. Then you have another World War. Then you have a Cold War, where it's the threat of nuclear annihilation. So people start questioning the fact that, okay, before the pre-modern period,
negative view of the world, very depressing. In fact, he spent the last 10 years of his life saying science. He is a very honest atheist. And so he takes it to its logical conclusion. This is what you end up with. A lot of atheists today, they don't think much further than, I don't believe in God. Like, well, okay, give me that. I just stole your Apple Watch. Like, why'd you do that? That's wrong. It's like, I don't know. If there is no God, there is no wrong, there is no right, there is no, And so Nietzsche is very honest, with that.
And he would say the atheist that does that isn't taking their atheism seriously enough because they're not wrestling with these questions.
Now, I would say when I first was teaching, this was probably about 10 years ago, this was before a lot of this has taken place because, we have seen such a shift in the last 5 years, it's incredible. But we still have this remnants of this modernist era, but it's changing fast. And so this is why there's this culture clash happening right now with, you're seeing and hearing, these things, and it's sort of like, what is happening right now? It's this clashing. The modern era would say things like, they believed science was the answer, science is the absolute truth. And so they would say, well, scientists say. Before it was the Bible says, or God says. Then it turned into, well, scientists say. And that is just accepted in culture, society. Oh, well, the scientists said it. Okay, well, then that's true. Or, it's sort of, I believe in science. It's whatever science says, that just must be true. And we sort of switched out the clerical robes of the priests and the clergy and the pastors and the preachers for lab coats. And so if somebody in a lab coat says something, then it must be true. And even the way the language is used is like, well, scientists say. It's like, well, who? Exactly. I mean, they're just sort of this unnamed entity that, well, scientists. It's like, okay, so if I get a degree, am I now a scientist and I can just say whatever? It's like, well, scientists say. But even now, so that used to be more common. Today, science is really only used when it's convenient. Have you noticed that? If it goes against the narrative, then it's like, facts don't matter. But when it's very convenient, it's, scientists say that. So we're kind of in this chaotic period where it's like two competing worldviews happening.
Well, that's also what postmodernism will do. Like, they embrace contradictions. Like, they embrace the fact that life is absurd and meaningless. So then there's no point in trying to parse out something logical enough. Embrace what you can, use what you can to win. Because at the end of the day, one virtue that they do adhere to is power.
Yeah. In fact, we're gonna, I think we'll kind of look at postmodernism itself. If you were to define postmodernism, it's difficult to define because it is full of contradictions. But everything is really based on like these power struggles.
Yeah.
Everything's all about power.
Since they don't believe that there is anything such as a transcendent, all that exists is us. So, and this goes back to Nietzsche's problem. How are you going to act in the world then? Nietzsche called it the will to power, where the person is going to become the Ubermensch, and then will sort of rule over other people as well, according to his will. That sets a very dangerous precedent, but we're sort of in this domain now where you have a lot of people where it's like you have the crisis of the modern period. You can't define absolute truth in a sense through science. Science can tell you how the universe works. It can't tell you why the universe is. That's a whole nother question. And it can't tell you, for instance, have you guys seen the movie Jurassic Park? This is a prime example and a great example of this argument. So remember the part where they're talking about they created dinosaurs. And the character Ian Malcolm says, okay, you created these things, but you never stopped back to think, should you create these things? That's a big crucial distinction. Science is not philosophy. Philosophy and theology can tell us about what's moral, questions about free will, the afterlife. Science cannot do those things. It can only tell you how to create an atom bomb. It can't tell you whether or not you can use it or should use it. So from that, you have a crisis of meaning in our culture, where you have a whole generation now who's like, okay, like, this is what we've adopted, but we feel meaningless. There's no overarching meaning. What do? We will then now create our own truth. So this personal preference, a lot of times in protest to whatever objectively exists or might exist, because they wouldn't believe that the objective is real.
Now, most people on the street, I mean, they've not given any of this much thought.
No.
In fact, I would even argue some teachers and things like that probably don't fully understand or comprehend this. But a lot of this is the theology, this is the mindset, the worldview. Everything is seen through this lens of power. And so that means anything that is currently in power or is seen as, quote, traditional, that got there through force, through power. And so therefore it is illegitimate, it needs to be taken down. And so fill in the blank with what that might be. Christianity, it always irked me when, colleagues would be like, well, we need to embrace postmodernism into Christianity. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Postmodernism is the enemy of Christianity. They cannot coexist. Postmodernism's goal is to dismantle Christianity because it sees it as sort of this traditional establishment that needs to be taken down. The patriarchy, men need to be torn down. And if you look in our society and in culture, it's everywhere. Any view of man or mansplaining, I think is something that's a term, ladies, mansplaining, where a man explains something.
Even the idea of the family structure, this is an oppressive force.
Oppressive force, you've got to tear it down.
There's a woman I just read yesterday. Her name is Shulamith Firestone. She was a feminist in the '60s. She's part of second wave feminism, and she argued that the patriarch or the family structure is so oppressive that we even need to emancipate the children from the parents. And she even advocated for a very laboratory form of reproduction, so that women won't even feel the oppressive force of needing to reproduce. But that all goes back to Karl Marx. Marx is one of the founders of postmodernism as well. He was not a postmodernist himself, but what they've done is they've taken a lot of ideas, and here he's talking about economics, oppressor and oppressed, you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. They take that language and then apply it to other social structures and social situations.
When we're talking about social justice, it's not about justice. It's about oppressor oppressed. It's Marxism, it's a postmodern concept. And this is where we need to be very careful as believers, as Christians, as the church. We need to understand what they're saying before we engage in conversation, before we agree, before we put a post on Facebook. Crying out loud, stop. Just stop. Sorry. We don't fully understand, so terms are being redefined, and we don't even know that they're being redefined. So people are like, oh yeah, I can get on board with that. And it's like, no. That doesn't mean what you think it means. It means something completely different.
They do not believe that, since they believe there is no such thing as an objective truth, they don't believe that language functions in any meaningful way as to communicate truth. What it communicates is power.
Even what he's saying.
Yeah, so it's like they look at language as power games, and this goes back to, this will be another founder of this era, Michel Foucault. For him and what he articulated and for the postmodernists, whenever someone uses language, they're playing power. They're trying to manipulate somebody else. So anything that we have in society that's used, where we use language, there's some sort of scheme, some sort of power play.
Her.
Which then the purpose is to overthrow that oppressive power play and then rechange the language, reshape it according to your power, according to your will of power, according to your truth, which is where pronouns come into play. So, like, for instance, here's an article from the New York Times that I printed off back in, I think it's summer, but it's a guide to neopronouns. And the article begins, are you a person, place, or thing? We have good news. And it completely goes through and tries to redefine language to the point of
Using language.
Yeah, using language, which at the end of the day is meaningless. So it's like, again, it's like embracing the contradiction there. But to the point, where you're using a third person plural for a first person singular. So like that throws the English language on its head. Good luck teaching a kid first grade how to do grammar now. Like that's gone.
It's so funny because people who are coming from the East, like in China or even India, when they come here and all this stuff is being brought up, they're like, we hate English. It's like, it was difficult before, but now it is like, it makes no sense, you know, to their mind, to their thinking.
And it keeps changing too. And if you're not up on it, then they say, well, you're a bigot. Like, I recently saw there was a person in politics who used the term two-spirited, like TWO, like number two-spirited people. And that's a relatively new one, you know. And I stay up on this stuff, and I was like, well, that one's pretty new to me. But of course, anyone who didn't understand it, she said, well, you're just a bigot, and, you know, identifying people correctly.
Yeah, so, again, I mean, anything that is seen as, like gender is something that is very, very hot topic right now, trending, and gender is something that is seen as, it's been established, it's, you know, it needs to be torn down. So traditional gender roles, male, female, you know, that has to be, taken down as well. What I find fascinating though, like, when you look at what a lot of young people are faced with, they are getting this hours a day. Hours a day, I'd say. It is everywhere. Whatever app, advertising, YouTube, TikTok, I mean, Amazon, it is everywhere. And they are constantly bombarded in little ways, so that, and that's how you shape a world, is you just, you know, little by little by little, and to the point where it's like, it's so major that it's like, you think like, well, wait a minute, where did that come from? This is just, you know, a cultivation of many things. Many kids, I mean, there was a kid in our neighborhood who, you know, she's, I think like 11, and it's like, she, gender, doesn't know what gender she is. She accused my daughter of being a bigot, because, you know, I forget what it was now, it was so stupid. But my daughter is suddenly like, I didn't even know what a bigot was, you know, but it's like these catchphrases and these terms are becoming very common, that kids soak it up like a sponge and they pick up on this stuff. And it's, I mean, it is everywhere. Post-colonialism is something. I mean, just when it comes to Thanksgiving, we're gonna do something a little different this year for Thanksgiving. And just ask your kids about pilgrims, and they're probably what? I mean, you hear it all the time as the children's minister.
I heard it at kids' church, actually.
Yeah, kids' church, so it's your kids.
Okay, so it was on the eve of Thanksgiving, I had kids' church, so I was like, I'm gonna do something on the Puritans. You know, because church history is part of my background. So I asked the kids, hey kids, about the Puritans or the Pilgrims? And this one girl's like, oh yeah. I was like, she's like, I was like, well, who were they? She's like, they were some really bad people. And I was like, okay, we gotta, they're like, the art of teaching history with nuance has been thrown out the window.
Yeah.
It's like very black and white. There's no like grays or anything. It's either you're holy, righteous, or you're a racist bigot. And a lot of the stuff also, I will say, with postmodernism, you have postmodern historians that like, a postmodernist does not believe that objective history is even possible. This is where you're going to get something like the 1619 Project, like if you guys have heard of that one, but it's trying to redefine and reshape American history where the founding is not on 1776, but 1619, because according to them, what they will argue is that's when the first slave came over. And what they will then reshape it as America was built upon slavery. Now, historically, that's not the case. That's not saying that slavery didn't exist, but it wasn't built. That's way too simplistic of an explanation. And it doesn't matter how many historians who are not these right-wingers who have said this is not real history, it doesn't matter, because she herself and the postmodernists, what they'll say is, well, you can't do objective history. So what we do is we refashion history according to our narrative. So it doesn't matter what the facts are or what really might have happened. It's, here's our story. Now how can we use some of this stuff to then put our story into it? It's like they're putting the story into it.
It kills history, study of history. It kills pushing my narrative, then, like, who are you to say, but that never worked.
Well, if there's no objectivity, you should be able to do whatever you want on the
Yeah.
exam, and it should not matter. You should just say, well, this is my truth.
Very hypocritical, though. There was one other area, a lot of feminism today, and this is where young girls are targeted a lot. Because here's another thing to understand, they are targeting children. That's the goal, because, you know, it's easier, when you think of propaganda and things like that, I mean, that's what you see here. And, with a lot of kids, like with feminism, especially with women, you'll just see movies where now, you know, the girl is depicted in a certain light to the male. If anybody's seen the latest Cinderella movie on Amazon, perfect example. I think every male is like, I mean, it's bad. Like, they're not even trying to hide it. I even read some articles from leftists who it's like, okay, that's a little preachy. You know, which, you know, it's gotta be bad that way, but it just, I mean, the story of Cinderella just absolutely dismantles it, and, I mean, you know, who needs a man, and so when they talk about feminism today, it's not about women getting to work and what other.
Yeah, don't think of it as voting or working. That's not what it is.
Well,
That's how they'll try to package it around election years for people. You know, oh, if you don't agree with this candidate, you're anti-woman, and you don't want women to vote, and you don't want women to work. That's not what feminism is, modern feminism. The first wave of feminism, way back in the day, was more about the equal rights stuff. That's not the case from the 60s onward. 60s onward, it was a much more radical movement. It was heavily rooted in Marxism. They had that oppressor-oppressed, you know, view of the world, that two-tier view of the world, and the oppressors were the males. There was a feminist named Marilyn French, and she even argued for sort of like in prehistory, primeval history, there was a sort of an Edenic, utopic vision of the world where all the women were the ones who ruled. And then there was a fall where the males then overtook the power from the women, and that's how you get the patriarchy, and that's how you get our society today. There's no like historical evidence for that, but this is what a lot of them push, and they're true believers in that narrative, mind you. But it is very much the idea that any form, like I said, of the lady earlier, they believe that even the family structure is oppressive, and expecting the woman like to even have to carry the child is a form of oppression that needs to be done away with.
Even if women want to do it.
But yeah, well,
That's kind of the irony.
That was the thing. Simone de Beauvoir, French lady, was a little crazy, but she was French.
That was the worst part.
But I mean, she argued that you don't even know what gender you are when you're born and you go about your life. You don't know what gender you are. You're told what gender you are. You're told what sex you are. So she argues that gender and sex is not something that's inherent. This is part of that postmodern play. But she also believed that if we give women freedoms, and she said feminism is not freedom. That's not what it's about. Because if we give women freedom, statistically, you know what happens? We see it a lot in upper middle class women. A lot of times they don't want to work and they stay at home with their kids, which is fine. I'm not. But she said, the feminist ladies, like, that's wrong. We can't have women doing that, so we have to force them not to do those things. So that's modern feminism.
And that's why you won't see any like heroes of stay-at-home moms or anything like that in movies or anything.
The ultimate irony is
That's
you
offensive.
have the upper middle class stay-at-home moms who are the radical feminists, and I'm like, oh my god, you do not have any understanding of what you're talking about.
Now, I mean, the ultimate goal for postmodernism, and this gets played into the critical theories and social justice. It is Western civilization is the ultimate oppressive force, and it has to come down. We have to bring down Western civilization. It's oppressive. The irony is, and we talked about this, if you tear down Western civilization, what are you left with? Okay? Look at what's happening in Afghanistan. Do you think the Taliban is really going to be interested in gender studies? You know, so they are sitting on a branch and they're sawing it off, saying, this is gonna work. This is definitely gonna work. I've got a good feeling about this. And it's ultimately gonna come crashing down because China laughs at this. In fact, China pushes a lot of this because they know that this crumbles
They
Western
push it in
civilization.
America.
Yeah.
They don't push it in their culture.
They don't in their culture.
They banned a lot of this.
They think it's absurd.
Because they realize what the purpose of it is for, is to erode culture.
And Americans are just soaking it up like sponges. I don't know. What is interesting, and this is where, I mean, just the widespread delusion is, you know, just, I deal a lot with like skeptics. And so I will have conversations with people who, they want to know, okay, what evidence, what proof is there, you know, that the Bible is trustworthy of God, of this. And then they would turn right around and hear where it's trending that there are now 72 genders, and they will just accept that lie. To the point of, yeah, okay, I think children should have the choice to, and it's like, whoa, hold on. First of all, where are you, have you read studies? Can you cite any studies or research that has been done? No, not a single one. Why then do you just accept this blindly? And when they stop to think about it, they're not sure, they don't want to be a bigot. And it's that mob mentality of what takes place in social media. I know of a family where a girl, she was struggling with a lot of this, and she pretty much, the family was like, okay, we're going to take her out of school for a short period. We're going to cut her off of all social media, and then afterwards, if she still feels this way, then okay. But we're going to check and see, is this her, or is this the pressure of, and after, I think it was maybe like 3 or 4 months, it was an addiction. The dopamine levels of the devices and social media and everything, it is like handing teenagers whiskey bottles and saying, here, deal with your emotions. And so after that, it was almost like this fog had lifted from her mind, like, no, I don't want to do that, that's ridiculous. But she had just been so conditioned into, you know, viewing this. And again, this was a family that was just like, okay, if this is what she wants to do, that's fine. But we're going to make sure this is her and not these outside influences. And sure enough, when it came to just, you know, her, it's almost like a blur. Like, I don't really know what I was thinking. It's because she wasn't.
Groupthink is a very powerful thing, and the amount of social pressure that's on kids right now to conform to this is exponential. Like, it's off the charts.
You deal with it.
I just got a text from a youth who just went off to college, and he already sent me a text where this wasn't even like, typically in the past you find this stuff sort of like in English classes, sociology was a big one. But you wouldn't typically find them in more of the science areas. Well, that's not the case anymore. He's in more of a science degree, and they presented him with basically a list of like a test, which will determine like his future in the program. And this test had nothing to do with math, which is crucial to his area of study. Everything to do with his thoughts on social justice. And the way they worded the questions, it was like he sent me screenshots, and because he was asking like, how do I do this? Like, how do I answer it? Should I answer it? This is my future at stake. What do I do? Like, he's having a big crisis. And the way they worded the questions was incredibly manipulative. This was unlike anything that I ever experienced in college, or any of us. And if you haven't been there in the past, I'd say a few years, like this is on a whole nother level. Like, this was straight up, here's a question, but we're really telling you what you need to say, and if you don't say what we want you to say, there'll be consequences. So they're using coercion. So it's like, okay, if you don't believe this, and like you're trying to live a good life for Christ, like what do you do? That's what he's now facing. That's what a lot of us are going to be facing too, because it's like there's no avoiding this stuff at this point. But the way they worded those questions, there was a reason why they do that. It's the same thing, Soviets did with children, and the Germans did with children. You word things in a way to get the person to write it, it's like you're confessing a creed. So it's sort of by you doing it and by you writing it, even if you don't believe it now, it moves you a little, and it moves you more. Even if you write a paper you don't believe in, if you are writing from the perspective as if you do believe in it, it does move you. Psychologically, it does rewire you. That's why they do it.
And they know this. They do know this. A lot of people probably on the lower levels, they don't realize it, but the people, kind of the architects of this, I mean, they do know this. And we're running out of time, but I would say this. I've seen parents fighting back in public school with some of this stuff. We were talking about this. Whereas I applaud the effort, the reality is, I'd say the majority of those very parents who are fighting it in the public schools, in a few years, they will be paying tens of thousands of dollars for people to pretty much indoctrinate, teach their kids the very thing they were fighting for at the school council. They're just gonna pay tens of thousands of dollars because we all have to go to college, right? That's what we've been told. Everybody has to go to college. And so everybody has to go to, you know, what did you call it? It's sort of like modern.
It's sort of, think of it almost like the modern church, where this is where you go to be trained as a priest and the evangelist, then you go out to the missions field. That's what the modern university has become.
And so
Like it's nothing, it is nothing more than.
there are some who are watching these parents fight this and they're laughing because they're like, you idiots, you have no idea. You're gonna be paying us money to be teaching this to your kids.
Well, and one last thing I'll say, because next week, I guess we're gonna talk more about the actual critical theory of everything. But I will say, like, there's been a misunderstanding, like, when I watch these videos, like, of parents at these school meetings, they'll say, like, are you teaching my kid critical race theory? And they'll say, we have no curriculum called critical race theory. We don't know what you're talking about. And this is where the misunderstanding is occurring. There is no curriculum called critical race theory. It's not something like your kid will go to school and the teacher like, okay, well, today we're gonna learn critical race theory. Get out your critical race theory book. That's not what this thing is. Critical race theory is a prism, or like think of it as glasses to then look at other topics. So it's something that's sort of going to already be in your textbooks. So it's already, and I guarantee you it is already in like a lot of history textbooks and stuff. It's a methodology that is used to then analyze other topics through the prism of critical race theory. So biology can no longer be just beyond biology. We have to look at through a racial angle. History can no longer just be history. We have to interpret through critical race theory. That's a big, crucial nuance that's sort of being lost in the mix of all this.
So people will believe critical race theory without ever hearing critical race theory. I mean, they'll just already believe. It is probably one of the most brilliant ways of conversion that I think, you know, because you're converting people without even fully realizing, without entering it. I would say something else about, you know, these town hall meetings or these meetings is that the other thing is, what a lot of these families also don't realize is their kids are probably at home being taught most of this through TikTok and other apps. Because TikTok, particularly TikTok, we'll get into this more next week, it is specifically targeted for this. They don't even hide it now. It's just right there. And you know, you talked about the social pressure. You might be wondering, like, well, why are there so many that are saying, you know, well, I'm bi or I'm this or that? It's because if you are on one of these platforms, if you are not, you are looked upon like, well, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you against, you know, gay people? Are you against bisexual? Are you against? It's like, well, no, I just, you know, I don't like dudes. It's like, but you know, well, then you must have issues. There is this, as adults, we might look at it and be like, oh, that's just ridiculous. But to a young person, to a child, to a teen, that is very confusing. Very, very confusing. And parents today don't have conversations with their kids. And so this is how they're being taught.
And next week we'll talk about queer theory, but there's a correlation between the rise of tech and also the rise of people who identify as part of LGBTQ. They coincide. To a rate, like there's a jump where kids start identifying, and then to a rate where it's like, well, a jump like that
very misleading.
It is.
So, I must go, I have to go preach, well, I get to go preach in Kentucky, so I've got to be trying. Time. So, hopefully you'll all be here next week and have a great time. There is hope.